She walked until the water ran out. She placed the boy under a bush so she wouldn't see him die of thirst. And then she heard the voice. It wasn't the first time an angel spoke to Hagar in the desert, but this time the promise was different. From him would come a great nation. Ishmael, Abraham's rejected son, would become the father of princes, and the prophecy was fulfilled in a way no one expected. The story you're about to discover doesn't begin in Mecca in the 7th century. It begins 2,600 years earlier in a tent in the Negev desert with a brutal decision made by a desperate woman. Sarah, Abraham's wife, had waited 25 years for the promise of a son. 25 years of barrenness, of social shame, of whispers in neighboring tents. And then finally, Isaac was born, the son of promise, the legitimate heir. But there was a problem. Isaac wasn't Abraham's only son. 14 years earlier, when Sarah's patience ran out and God's promise seemed like a cruel lie, she offered her Egyptian servant Hagar to her husband. Genesis chapter 16 records with surgical precision, Sarai took Hagar, her Egyptian servant, and gave her as a wife to Abram. No romance, no choice for Hagar, property transferred, and from the forced union, Ishmael was born, Abraham's firstborn, the boy who for 14 years grew up thinking he was the only heir. Now Isaac was there, weaned, celebrated, glorified, and Sarah saw something that chilled her, Ishmael mocking. Genesis chapter 21 verse 9 uses a specific Hebrew word, metzachek. It can mean playing, mocking, or imitating. But Sarah interpreted it as a threat, the servant's son ridiculing the son of promise. And in that moment, she made the decision that would tear history in two, cast out this bondwoman and her son. But the most brutal part remains to be revealed. God agreed. Abraham was devastated. Genesis chapter 21 verse 11 says that Sarah's word was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son. He loved Ishmael. 14 years of memories, first steps, first words, the boy he carried on his shoulders. And now Sarah demanded that he send them away to die in the desert, because that's what it was. Without enough water, without provision, a woman and a child expelled to the Negev had no chance. Abraham hesitated until God spoke. Verse 12, "Let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad and because of thy bondwoman. In all that Sarah hath said unto thee, hearken unto her voice." God commanded Abraham to obey Sarah, and then he added something that changes everything. "For in Isaac shall thy seed be called, and also of the son of the bondwoman will I make a nation, because he is thy seed." Two promises, two nations, one God. The next day, at dawn, Abraham placed bread and a skin of water on Hagar's shoulders. Just that, for a journey that killed experienced men in 3 days without adequate provision. He didn't give camels, he didn't give servants, he didn't give gold, he gave bread and water. And he sent mother and child away toward the wilderness of Beersheba. The Hebrew word used is shalach, to send away, to repudiate, to divorce. It wasn't a voluntary departure, it was expulsion. Hagar wandered. The text doesn't specify how many days, but archaeologists who studied routes from Beersheba estimate that water from an average skin lasted 2 to 3 days for 2 people under scorching sun. When it ran out, she went into emotional collapse. Genesis chapter 21 verse 15, "And the water was spent in the bottle, and she cast the child under one of the shrubs." Cast. Violence in the gesture. She didn't lay him down gently, she threw him. Absolute desperation of a mother who can no longer bear to see her child suffer, and then she moved away. And she went and sat her down over against him a good way off, as it were a bow shot, for she said, "Let me not see the death of the child." Specific distance, approximately 80 to 120 meters, far enough not to hear the final groans. too close not to know it was happening, and she lifted up her voice and wept. The Hebrew says, Watisa et kola watevk. Literally, she gave her voice and wept, crying the tears through the desert. A mother's wail watching her son die, but God heard, not Hagar's crying. Verse 17 is precise. God heard the voice of the lad. Ishmael, the child abandoned under the bush, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven. For the second time in her life, an angel found her in the desert. But now it wasn't to send her back, it was to reveal the future. What aileth thee, Hagar? Fear not, for God hath heard the voice of the lad. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him in thine hand, for I will make him a great nation. Great nation. Goy Gadol in Hebrew. The same expression used for the promise made to Abraham about Isaac. It wasn't a lesser promise, it wasn't consolation, it was a parallel decree of greatness. And then God opened her eyes. Verse 19. And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. The well had been there all along. She hadn't seen it because despair blinds. She filled the skin. She gave the boy to drink, and Ishmael lived. But what came next? No one expected. The biblical text is brutally economical about Ishmael's following years. Genesis chapter 21, verses 20 and 21. And God was with the lad, and he grew, and he dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer. And he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took him a wife out of the land of Egypt. 3 verses to summarize decades. God with him. Growth, skill with the bow, marriage to an Egyptian. And silence. The biblical narrative abandons Ishmael to focus on Isaac. Entire chapters dedicated to Isaac finding Rebekah, to the twins Esau and Jacob, to the 12 tribes of Israel. Ishmael, a footnote. Genesis chapter 25 lists Ishmael's 12 sons in 4 quick verses, 12 princes as God promised, but no stories, no drama, no apparent relevance to the plan of redemption. Or was there? Here's what most people ignore. The promise made to Ishmael wasn't just about numbers, it was about specific national character. Genesis chapter 16 verse 12. When the angel first appeared to Hagar, already pregnant and fleeing from Sarah, he said something disturbing about who Ishmael would be. He will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. The Hebrew word translated as wild is per Adam, literally wild donkey of a man or wild man. Not domesticated, not subjugated, free and conflictive, his hand against everyone, everyone against him. Not a prophecy of evil, a prophecy of radical independence and perpetual conflict. And the last phrase, he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren, not far from them, in front of them, confronting them. 4,000 years later, the fulfillment is impossible to deny. But how did a prophecy about a boy abandoned in the desert transform into a religion of 1,800,000,000 people? The answer requires you to understand something crucial about how God works with human rejection. Sarah rejected Ishmael. Abraham gave in, but God didn't. 3 times in the Genesis account, God intervenes directly on behalf of Hagar and Ishmael. 3 angelic appearances. First, when Hagar fled pregnant, the angel found her near a fountain on the way to Shur and sent her back with a promise of countless descendants. Second, when expelled with child Ishmael, God heard the boys crying and showed the well. Third, implied in the continuing blessing, and God was with the lad. Think about the brutal irony. Isaac, the chosen son, was born by miracle. Ishmael, the rejected son, survived by miracle. Both depended equally on divine intervention to exist. The difference wasn't in whom God loved, it was in who would carry the messianic lineage. And that distinction, though theologically crucial, didn't mean God abandoned the other son. Genesis chapter 17 verse 20 records a conversation between God and Abraham before Isaac's birth. Abraham had just heard that Sarah, at 90 years old, would have a son. He laughed. And then he said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before thee." A desperate father's plea, "Don't take Ishmael from me, let him live under your favor." And God responded, "As for Ishmael, I have heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation." Hebrew verb tense, berachti oto, I have already blessed him, completed action, sealed decree. Before Sarah asked for expulsion, before Ishmael mocked Isaac, before the desert, God had already blessed Ishmael with an irrevocable decree. But the blessing would come with a price no one calculated. Ishmael's 12 sons grew up and spread throughout the Arabian Peninsula. Genesis chapter 25 lists the names Nebajoth, Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Dumah, Massa, Hadar, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedemah. 12 princes of 12 tribes. And the text adds a crucial geographical detail. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names. By their towns and by their settlements, 12 princes according to their tribes, and they dwelt from Havilah unto Shur, that is before Egypt, as thou goest toward Assyria, Havilah to Shur, a region encompassing practically the entire Arabian Peninsula, from the border with Egypt in the south to Assyria in the north. Massive territory, desert, inhospitable, but strategic. It controlled trade routes between Africa, Asia, and Europe. Caravans of spices, incense, myrrh, gold. Ishmaelite tribes weren't insignificant nomads. They were controllers of international trade. And something more, they were warriors. The prophecy about Ishmael being an archer was literally fulfilled. Archaeologists discovered that Bedouin tribes of the region developed a unique technique of archery on horseback. They could shoot arrows at full gallop with lethal precision. Sedentary armies couldn't reach them. They attacked, plundered, and disappeared into the desert where no one dared pursue. For centuries, descendants of Ishmael and descendants of Isaac coexisted in tension exactly as prophesied. Hand against everyone. Everyone against him. Ishmaelite merchants appear in Joseph's story. They were the ones who bought Joseph from his brothers and sold him in Egypt. Midianites, possibly related to Ishmaelites, attacked Israel during the period of the Judges. Nabateans, probable descendants of Nebajoth, son of Ishmael, built Petra and dominated trade for centuries. But none of this explains Islam. The key is in what happened 600 years after Christ, in the city of Mecca, with a man named Muhammad ibn Abdullah, direct descendant, according to Islamic tradition, of Ishmael through Kedar, the second son. Mecca was already a religious center before Muhammad. It housed the Kaaba, a cubic structure that Muslims believe was built by Abraham and Ishmael as a house of worship to the one God. But in the 7th century, the Kaaba was filled with idols, 360 tribal gods. Muhammad began having visions at 40 years old. Angel Gabriel, according to Islamic account, appeared in a cave on Mount Hira and commanded, "Iqra," read or recite. Muhammad claimed to be illiterate. The angel repeated 3 times, and revelations began that would last 23 years and form the Quran. The central message was a direct shock against Arab polytheism. There is only one God. La ilaha illallah. There is no deity except God. And Muhammad was the final messenger, seal of the prophets. The same message Abraham received 2,500 years earlier. The same God of Isaac, but now revealed through a descendant of Ishmael. The question that paralyzes Christians and Jews is this: was Muhammad right? The Bible doesn't mention Muhammad. It doesn't explicitly prophesy Islam, but it does prophesy Ishmael. And the characteristics of the Ishmaelite nation described in Genesis fit with disturbing precision into Islam. Great nation, 1,800,000,000, 12 princes, 12 imams in Shia tradition, 12 caliphs in Sunni, hand against everyone, everyone against him. 1,400 years of conflict with Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism among themselves. He shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren, not far away, in front, confronting. But there's something deeper, something most people ignore because it requires admitting theological discomfort. God really did bless Ishmael. It wasn't an empty promise. It wasn't consolation for losing the birthright. It was a genuine decree of greatness. And if God said he would make Ishmael a great nation, and today Islam is the second largest religion in the world, influencing the politics, economy, and culture of dozens of countries, isn't this, in some twisted and mysterious way, a literal fulfillment of prophecy? Here's where most people stumble, assuming that God's blessing implies complete theological approval, but the Bible repeatedly shows that God blesses people and nations outside the messianic lineage without endorsing everything they do. God blessed Ishmael. That doesn't mean Islam is theologically correct. It means God keeps what he promises, even when the promise was made to the rejected son of a problematic union. And perhaps that's the most brutal point of all. The origin of Islam, according to the Bible, isn't demonic invasion. It's a direct consequence of flawed human decisions within Abraham's own family. Sarah didn't trust God's promise and offered Hagar. Abraham gave in to pressure. Sarah became jealous and demanded expulsion. Abraham obeyed by divine order that frankly sounds more like reluctant permission than enthusiastic command. Hearken unto her voice doesn't seem like joyful prescription. It seems like God working within human mess. And from the mess, God still made a nation. This connects to a broader theological truth. God doesn't waste rejection. He doesn't waste pain. He doesn't waste abandonment. Hagar was abused as a surrogate womb, discarded when she was no longer useful, expelled to die. Ishmael was humiliated by his half-brother, rejected by his father, exiled in the desert, and from both, God made a lineage that would shape world history. The question isn't whether Islam is true. Biblically, the answer is no. Jesus is the Messiah who came through Isaac, not Ishmael. But the tormenting question is, why did God allow the rejected son to generate a religious movement that would compete with Christianity for the hearts of billions? Perhaps the answer lies in God's character revealed throughout the entire story. God chooses the rejected. David was the ignored eighth son. Moses was a stuttering fugitive. Ruth was a Moabite widow. Rahab was a prostitute. Jesus was born in a stable to a questioned mother. Paul was a persecutor. The biblical pattern isn't God blessing only the obvious chosen ones. It's God specifically reaching the discarded. Ishmael was discarded by Sarah. Abraham loved him, but sent him away. And God said, "This one is mine too," but there's a price in being blessed outside the primary covenant. Isaac received the promised land. Ishmael received desert. Isaac received an eternal covenant. Ishmael received 12 princes. Isaac generated the line that culminated in Christ. Ishmael generated a line that to this day questions Christ. The blessings weren't equal, nor should they be, because the plan of redemption had a specific path: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, David, Jesus. But the alternative path, Ishmael's parallel line, still carried divine promise. And this creates tension that persists 4 millennia later. Here's the devastating irony that closes the circle. Sarah expelled Hagar and Ishmael to protect Isaac's inheritance, eliminate competition, ensure the blessing wouldn't be divided. And the result? Perpetual conflict between descendants of both. Jerusalem disputed, Holy Land claimed by two groups tracing origin to the same patriarch. Dome of the Rock built exactly where Solomon's temple stood. wailing. Wall on one side, golden dome on the other. The attempt to protect the blessing generated the division. What if Sarah had trusted that God could bless both without diminishing either? What if Abraham had fought harder for Ishmael's permanence? What if the family had remained united, with Isaac as heir to the messianic promise and Ishmael as an honored brother? History would be different, but it wasn't, because humans choose fear instead of faith, scarcity instead of abundance, exclusion instead of inclusion, and God works with the choices we make. Genesis chapter 25, verses 7 to 9 record Abraham's death. And these are the days of the years of Abraham's life which he lived, 163 years. Then Abraham gave up the ghost and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. And his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah. Read again. Isaac and Ishmael. Abraham died at 175 years old, and the biblical text records something few notice. Isaac and Ishmael, together, buried him in the cave of Machpelah. The two brothers separated by decades of resentment, side by side, carrying their father's body, silence between them. Hands that perhaps touched for the first time since childhood. Imagine the scene. Isaac was 75 years old when his father died. Ishmael, 89. Old men, entire lives lived separately. Isaac in Canaan with flocks and inherited riches. Ishmael in the desert with his 12 sons and scattered tribes. Decades without seeing each other, perhaps without speaking. And then the news arrives. Abraham died. And both came. We don't know who arrived first. If there was an embrace, if there were tears, if there were recriminations or requests for forgiveness. The text doesn't say, it only records, buried him together. They carried the body of the father who loved them and who hurt them into the cave purchased to bury Sarah years before. The same Sarah who demanded the expulsion of one of them. Can you feel the tension? Isaac burying his father next to the mother who protected his inheritance. Ishmael burying his father next to the woman who hated him. But they do it together, because in that moment they weren't heir and rejected. They were sons. The rock sealed the entrance. The two lineages followed opposite paths. Isaac remained in Hebron, heir to the land. Ishmael returned to the desert, lord of the tribes. They never met again, according to biblical records. But for a few hours at that funeral, there was unity. Today, billions descend spiritually from one or the other. Jews and Christians look to Isaac. Muslims honor Ishmael. But that afternoon in Hebron, they were just two sons burying their father. Two men who shared blood, even if they didn't share destiny. You can visit the cave of Machpelah today. 2,000-year-old limestone structure protecting a 4,000-year-old tomb. Herod built walls around it in Man, the 1st century before Christ. Massive blocks, some weighing 50 tons. Muslims control the site now, Mosque of Abraham, but Jews have partial access. Divided days, separate schedules, simultaneous prayers prohibited. Muslims pray on one side, Jews on the other. The separation continues, exactly as prophesied. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. But for a moment, at that funeral 4,000 years ago, there was reconciliation, temporary, silent, but real. The promise was divided, but two sons' love for their father was the same.